Evelyn Conlon and Anne Haverty. Thank
you. We just go straight in to talk to Anne and to let her talk about the book. One of the things, of course, and some of you will know, most of you will know, that Anne is also a novelist and a poet, but then undertook this book, and now I'll let her speak about that. So I'm going to start by just saying hello to Anne and to welcome her, and to go straight in and ask you, how did the book come about in the very first place, which was in what year?
Well, it was my first book, so it holds a special place in my heart. I was young and foolish when I wrote it, and I had written some, stories and that, and I knew I wanted to write novels. I had no idea I wanted to write poetry yet. I was very grateful I wasn't a poet for various reasons. But then, so I was a bit, I suppose, just floundering a bit as to how exactly you wrote a novel. And what I would write and everything. And then I happened at the same time, and I was writing a bit of journalism and so on, and I met this woman called Gemma O'Connor, who was preparing a series of books about famous Irish women. And she very generously and, I suppose, whiskily asked me if I would like to write one, even though I hadn't written a book before. And so I did, and so there was a list of various possibilities of subjects, and basically I picked Markievicz because she was the one I knew least about. There was like Maud Gonne, which most of us knew something about, mainly because of her connection with the AIDS, of course, and then there were the Parnell sisters, there were people like that, but somehow Markievicz was the most mysterious to me. And I mean, looking back now, I think that was also a little bit foolish, because to embark on the life of somebody nothing whatsoever about could be a bit not the best idea. But anyway, I kind of threw myself into it and discovered that I really, really liked her, and that there was in fact a lot of information about her available to me, and that she was actually a far more significant figure than I had even assumed then.
Can I ask you just in case that there is anybody just in case there's anybody in the room who doesn't in fact know who she is, which I doubt very much, but could you just, I know it's a very hard thing for you to do because you go into such detail and your research is so well put together and also sensitively put together with an atmosphere of the times, and indeed with the sort of the novelists, even though you weren't a novelist then, but with that sort of storytelling aspect to it. But if I could ask you, just in case anybody doesn't know, if you could just briefly say, if someone arrived from Mars and you had to tell them who Constance Markievicz was, what would you say?
God, yeah, it's difficult, yeah, you write a book of 300, something pages, and then you have to try and... well, I think the most important thing is to say that she was a revolutionary, first and last. That was her mentality. That was the defining thing about her. And I mean, I don't mean just revolutionary in terms of, going out and with her gun and, I mean, she had that impulse to change, above all. And I think that's what distinguishes her from most of us, most people in the world. And of course, this was even more, noteworthy because she lived in a time, she was a woman, of course, a girl, at the time when she began her whole revolutionary impulse began to be apparent. She came from a class and a time, well, not so much the time. I think the time was very good for her from the terms of point of view of revolution. But she came from a class in which she departed really from every single standard and convention that you could depart from at that time. I know she was an aristocrat. She ended up spending her life among the ordinary people, the working classes of Dublin. She, of course, then, along with her long involvement, I mean, she was there right from the beginning, from the initial revolutionary, the beginnings of the revolutionary movement in Ireland in the early years of the 20th century, from about 1907 or 8. And she was there right to the end, to the late 1920s when she died. And in that time, she was basically a seminal figure in all the different strands of revolution that happened in those years. And of course, from a kind of a more, conventional point of view of her, success, she was the first woman ever elected to Parliament in these islands, or indeed in the world. She was the first Minister of State, in government, in cabinet. Again, in our islands, indeed in Europe and the world. So, yeah, she was an extremely important figure.
I didn't. Okay, I'm switching this on and off because I don't want the sound to be distracting you as Anne speaks. I didn't want to come just yet to the introduction, but I feel that I have to because of what you've just said there now. I know that the book came out again a second time in 2016, and you have an introduction in which you explain something about your own reaction to when it had come out the first time. And it's a very surprising introduction. It's quite shocking in a way, really. And I'd just like you to talk a little bit about that, and also what difference was there when the second issue came out. But if you would just explain a little bit about why...
Evelyn, can I ask you, when you say it's shocking, why do you say shocking?
Because it seemed to me that because I knew about her, that I thought everybody else knew about her. I think in your introduction you make it quite clear, and you make me see that in fact she was a wrongly forgotten woman, or put to the side as opposed to being seen as being central.
Yeah, I mean, it is very strange that, when I said that I chose Markievicz because I didn't know anything about her, I had studied history. I had at school, which is in fact where I learned whatever I did know about her was just from school, actually, rather than studying history later. And this only was because there was one photograph of her in our history book. And we had a wonderful teacher of history. I loved history. I think the curriculum we had was a very, very good curriculum in its day at that time. Much better, I think perhaps, even perhaps better than it is now. The only time she appears in that history book is a picture of her. I think, not quite this picture, but one of her holding the gun. The one holding, maybe you don't know the one holding the gun. And she, and I just said her name under Constance Markievicz. And I don't think there was anything else. There was no other reference to her or to why she was there or what she did. It was a completely token reference. Whereas, of course, all the other people involved in that time, they were all there. The signatories, the Bulmer Hobson, the various people who came later in the Civil War and the War of Independence and so on. And yet she, who had been there and who had helped, I do think that, only for her, in fact, the revolution might not have happened The rising might not have happened at all, as it did. And it certainly wouldn't have lasted for a whole week. I mean, it was the first time that such an attempt at gaining independence among all the little risings that had occurred in the previous centuries. This was the first one that was actually, had some sort of seriousness and lasted for some time, for a week. And it's because of her founding of the Fianna, that she recognised quite early on that the movement needed trained people, that there was no point in idealistic, untrained people going out and making a revolution, that you needed people who were going to be trained and knew actually how to go about it. And it was she who founded the Fianna, and so as a result, within a few years, you did have trained body of men and women who were able to actually, be serious. And that was a primary achievement of hers. And if she hadn't done that, it wouldn't have happened probably. Or wouldn't have happened to anything like the same extent. So where was that? Yeah. But this, she's never, mentioned in dispatches for that at all. I mean, if she is, it's usually kind of derogatorily as somebody who encouraged young boys to go and shoot guns and so on.
You talk about this about how handy she was with a gun, as they would say around certain places, and also what's interesting as well is that at the same time she's coming out as a deb, which is a wonderful description in the book. How did those two things sit together, do you think, in her life?
Well, she was. I mean, this is what things were for people who were brought up as she was. I mean, she was taught to shoot by her father. They were a hunting, shooting and fishing family, very seriously so. And her father taught her to shoot as he taught her brothers and probably her other sisters. It was regarded as a skill that a girl of her time and class would be useful. Not obviously to shoot people, but to shoot animals. And then in due course, she became, she was sent off to London to do the deb thing, because that also was what girls like her were expected to do. So it's a seamless, there's no contradiction to me in those things.
It's interesting when I was reading your description of it, I was brought to mind the woman Violet Gibson, whom I've just sort of been writing a short story about, who's the Irish woman who attempted to assassinate Mussolini and who almost succeeded. And as we know, if an Irish man had attempted to assassinate Mussolini, we'd know all about him. But we know very, very little about her. And she was of the same class. And indeed, she was taught to shoot by her father. But let's go back to this. There's another description in your book, and I don't know, possibly you might read a little bit out of it, or maybe you just want to describe it. But it's mentioned in our house quite a lot about your description of landlordism of the time. And in a way, I think what you do in this book is you set up a picture which is an absolute explanation for why the revolution happened.
Right, well, why don't I read it? Because, it's probably better to... I suppose this is an attempt just to explain in a very, in an objective, factual manner what the social conditions were in Ireland in that time and how things were arranged and how there was certain resentments and long-standing reasons for people wanting to change things. Now, I'll just read something first yet that that Constance wrote about how she herself saw it. Now she was a very, very good writer. She had an ability to write very vividly and very passionately. In a newspaper article, Constance described with revolutionary fervour the social structure of the Sligo countryside of her childhood. You saw the landlords in their big domains, mostly of Norman or Saxon stock, walled in and aloof, an alien class sprung from an alien race. The prosperous farmers were mostly Protestant, and hidden away among rocks in the mountainsides, or soaking in the slime and ooze of the boglands, or beside the Atlantic shore, where the grass is blasted yellow by the salt wind, you find the dispossessed people of the old Gaelic race in their miserable cabins. Now she had grown up there, and this is what she had witnessed during her childhood. Anyway, so then I talk about this like the landlord system. The landlord system was an aspect of Irish life that was becoming ever more contentious during Constance's youth. The majority of landlords were descendants of those successive waves of soldier adventurers who came during the 16th and 17th centuries to subdue Ireland on behalf of the Crown. The more prominent and effective among them were granted land in return for their services, land from which the native Irish were turned out and then readmitted as tenants. The first ancestor of Constance's to set up in Ireland was a Paul Gore, who rode in the Elizabethan campaigns in which the conquest of Ireland became conclusive. He was granted the nucleus of the Lissadell estate and was made a baronet of Ireland in 1621. The second great push came 50 years later, when Cromwell's bloody campaign uprooted the Irish and allowed English settlers to establish themselves throughout the country. The resistance of the Irish was sporadic and ineffective, but it was to remain as an aggravation for generations to come. The new proprietors saw themselves as brave and enterprising colonists, and Ireland as a colony to be exploited. And the colonised regarded them with bitterness, resentment, and hostility that flickered into insurrection at irregular intervals. There was certainly hatred on both sides, at least initially. With the self-justification typical of colonialism everywhere, the English found the Irish uncivilised. And indeed, they were not civilised in the English sense, and indolent. Their favourite prescription for peace and prosperity was to be rid of them entirely and to populate the land with a loyal and industrious peasantry from Scotland. To the Irish, their English conquerors were upstarts, foreigners, and the cause of their servility and poverty. The situation was exacerbated by the identification of both sides with opposing religions. In England, the Reformation and the establishment of the new Protestant Church were then burning issues, while the Irish generally remained immune to the controversy and maintained the old Catholicism. Along with the Protestant settlers came a Protestant clergy. As a means of subjugation, the penal laws, a set of punitive measures, including economic sanctions, were introduced, which reduced the Catholic population to the status of non-citizens. To the Irish, Protestantism came to be associated with coercion and privilege, and Catholicism symbolic of a private revolt, a badge of pride and independence in the face of defeat. By 1775, 95% of the land was owned by Protestants. By the early 19th century, turbulence had subsided into the apathy of an agrarian subsistence economy. The potato had been introduced, and its use became widespread, since a plot of ground under this crop could feed twice as many people as the same plot under corn. This tenant population increased dramatically throughout the first half of the century, while more and more of them lived in a state of distress which contemporary travellers and observers found shameful and abhorrent. The hostile relationship between landlord and tenant was by now largely replaced by a mutual tolerance and contempt. Whether landlordism was the principal reason for the endemic poverty is still open to question. The poorest tenants, certainly, and they numbered at least a quarter of the whole, were obliged to hand over as rent any cash earned from the sale of animals or grain, and much of this money was either spent abroad or sent to landlords who lived abroad. About 1/3 of Irish landlords were absentees. Because of this, and because most of the people had little or no disposable income, Ireland was notoriously undercapitalised. Irish industry was at first proscribed, then never actively encouraged. Ireland never experienced an industrial revolution.
No, I think that's a very interesting piece in the book, or a part of the book. It's a little bit like, I remember reading Robert Fisk's Pity the Nation, the book about the Lebanon. And in fact, in the introduction, in the one introduction, you understand exactly, practically all the problems in the Middle East. And in some ways I feel that small chapter, or that part of the chapter, gives a great explanation. I wanted to ask...
I suppose it does, if I went on, I would read about how Gladstone, the politician, the Liberal politician, how he was really, really virulent against Irish landlordism, and how it was it was part of the discourse in England, that kind of hostility and virulence to landlordism when Constance was only a girl. And so the fact that she would have kind of developed a kind of a similar attitude is therefore not surprising, even though obviously most of our own people chose to ignore it and turned their faces away, or regretted it deeply that such people were saying such things. But nonetheless, it didn't. Her attitude didn't come out of nowhere. It was very much part of the culture of the day. That sort of attitude towards landlordism.
Would there have been a big influence from Europe as well, or are you saying mainly that discussion was taking place? Do you think she was influenced, from outside of Ireland and England?
There's no great evidence that that from her political writings that she was aware of, of the. But of course, the same attitude was in Europe just as much in Ireland. The whole Russian question, the question of landlordism in Russia was almost very, very similar to the one in Ireland, and was, of course, getting exactly the same criticism and the same kind of stirrings about, a revolution that, would result in more or less in what happened in Russia as well in 1917. And it was a time of revolution. It was a very, very interesting, fermenting time. We tend to feel that it was this kind of peaceful, calm, where everything, the rich man at his whatever in his castle, the poor man at his gate, and everything. And then these revolutionaries came and messed everything up. But in fact, this was a really, really stirring time for everybody. How much she read or how much she was aware, it's hard to say.
Yeah.
But she did live in. Yeah. She did go and live in Paris in the early part of the century. Towards the end of the 19th century, early part of the 20th, and she couldn't have been unaware there of all the various, thinkers and philosophers that were talking like this.
Now, between the book that you did, between the two issues of the book, has it changed much? Did your attitude change much? I don't mean just to the reaction to the book, but what did you, when you went to look at it again, is there much difference between the two books?
difference, there's a slight, I suppose, since I researched the first version of this book, the Bureau of Military History has released its archives, which is a really brilliant resource. I mean, there's just so much stuff there, and I probably just only made a little dent in, what's available. So I was able to incorporate some stuff like that, but it would be more kind of little, emphasis, small differences of emphasis, or extra bits of, maybe anecdotes that people might have to say about her.
If I could just ask you there about the one that, the discussion that took place during the 2016 when there was something specifically said about her, or you felt that the way that a picture had been put up around Stephen's Green portrayed her in the wrong light.
I was very glad to be able to bring out this book again, because I don't know, maybe some people might be aware of, she does attract opprobrium. For some reason, she is, and I think I talk about it a little bit in my introduction. She is somebody that people like to dislike. She does seem to attract whatever people feel, whatever hostility people feel towards the 1916 and what happened. She seems so often to be the focus for it, And for instance, there's this story that certain people are quite, I could name up, 2 or 3 of them, we won't, like to trot out, which is the heinous crime, as they would like to say, that she shot a constable on Stephen's Green. Now this is a kind of one of those things that has been kind of on the go for a long time, and first of all, you have to say that if she, it's kind of a difficult thing to say, but if a constable was shot when people were trying to make their way into the Green to take over the Green on that morning. And of course, it is terrible that a constable was shot, but nonetheless, this was a revolution, and a serious revolution. If they were going to do it at all, such people were going to get shot on both sides. So that aside, was it she who did it? So, it has always been apparent to me that she really couldn't have been her, because she was, the constable was shot when the citizen army was entering the Green. He tried to prevent them at the gate over there. At that point, she was delivering Madeleine French-Mullen and I think Helena Maloney to City Hall, where they were meant to take up their positions. And she drove them in Madeleine French's car up there. And then she drove back down, stopping at a couple of points along the way, I think Jacobs was it? And then finally arrived in the Green once the Green was taken. The Green was taken when she arrived. So that would seem to put her out of the picture. But then somebody came up with this story of a diary in which a nurse claims that she saw Markievicz shoot the constable. And this has been kind of repeated and has been taken as read. And in fact, in the Green, I don't know if they're still there, but last year there was a kind of a display, kind of an exhibition placed there by the Board of Works, kind of detailing all the events in the Green and what happened. And Markievicz is described as shooting the constable. And they have a different story again. They have the constable walking through the Green. There's also another rather funny bit, I must tell you. But the constable is walking through the Green, and it kind of gets Constance off the hook a little bit, but this is another. And it says 3 people raised their guns to shoot him, and including her, and he dropped to the ground, and he was shot. But he didn't die immediately, he died later, a few hours later. Now, there was a programme made last year as well about this, the taking of the Green in this event. And this is a rather amusing scene because it's so unlikely. But this is a reenaction. I know this is a dramatic reenaction of the event. And the constable is shown walking down with his arms behind his back, walking through the Green, whistling. And now the revolution is now in progress. The thing is being taken, the Green has been taken. They're all there digging trenches and doing their thing and, stopping people coming along Stephen's Green outside. But we are shown a constable, walking down the Green with his arms behind his back, whistling, walking through under the trees. It's just, this is ridiculous. And I suppose it's to make him seem more that, the crime of shooting him was even worse because he was insouciant and he wasn't expecting it and so on. And he hadn't, he wasn't being aggressive in any way. Anyway, that's aside. Anyway, this diary that this nurse is meant to have written. So anyway, so this diary is meant to be in in London, in the archives in London, in the library there. But when you find this so-called diary, it's not a diary at all. It's only 2 typed sheets, and the evidence on it is even more outlandish so-called evidence, because the nurse arrived at the Green only at 1 o'clock and then claims to see and hear things that she couldn't possibly have seen in her because she was in a dining room on the other side of the Green. So I discussed this in my introduction as well. But it's an example of how, in a way, people want to believe the worst of Markievicz.
I've got quite a few more questions, but I think at this stage I might open it. And one of them being really, in a way, well, I'll ask you a last question before I open it to the floor. After you talk about this as your first book, and I know it was your first published book, did that research and did that writing of it affect the work that you subsequently did as a novelist or as a poet? Maybe you didn't.
I think it could. I could claim that it kind of helped me or showed me how to write novels. Because I realised, actually, it wasn't quite true that I hadn't written a novel. I had written a novel, or more or less written one, or kind of made a good stab at writing one. But it was one of those sort of airy-fairy kind of novels where, I hadn't really known how to structure it, how to kind of make us, have a beginning, it was all over the place. And I hadn't really kind of knuckled down to the reality that, you had to have characters, you had to have a plot of some kind, you had to, whereas when I wrote this, it had, it really showed me that, you need to kind of have a coherent structure and narrative. And I realised I really enjoyed doing, that to me was a very enjoyable way of writing. Yeah. And I suppose I could, in a way, it kind of taught me, actually you could write a novel, should be written in kind of the same way.
So it's more likely to have affected your novel writing rather than your poetry.
I think
that
so.
I'll accept.
Yeah.
All right, well I will now open to the floor because I presume there are some questions from people, some of whom will know a considerable amount, I suspect, and some who may not. So,
a simple question. When was she born? When did she die? What family did she have?
She was born in 1868. 68, I think. February 1868. She lived in Lissadell in Sligo all her life. I mean, not all her, until, she grew up in Lissadine, County Sligo, moved to London to study art, then to Paris, came back to live in Ireland in her 30s, lived in Dublin, and died in Dublin in 1927.
And at what stage did she marry?
Markievicz. Yeah, she married a Polish man, a fellow art student in Paris, who she met in Paris. He was a kind of gentry of, Polish gentry stock, and known as Count Markievicz, although it would seem that because they don't really have titles, the Count title does not exist in Poland, in fact. But Poles have traditionally, gentry Poles have traditionally taken and felt entitled to call themselves counts, especially when they're abroad. So he has always been known as Count Casimir Markievicz, and she married him in, I think, about 1904. She was probably early 30s. She had one daughter, Maeve, and she had one stepson, Stanislaus. Yeah, Casimir had been married before.
Yes, I wonder, could you speak about Yeats and their relationship?
Their relationship was kind of distant, but they were acquaintances. I mean, Yeats had Sligo relations, spent a lot of time in Sligo, the Pollux friends, and writes a lot about the Gore Booths. She was Gore Booth, I should have said, that was her name by birth, and he writes a lot about it in one of his autobiographies, because he says how he had held the Gore Booths in awe, and particularly Constance. And he had seen her, as a youth, riding across the countryside, and she was so beautiful and so strong and, wonderful horsewoman. And then finally, when he was a poet, when he was getting a name as a poet, he was invited to Lissadell to dinner and to stay for the weekend and so on. And he describes how this was a kind of an amazing thing for him to be able to at last have an entree into this world of the Gore Booths. It was it seems to have been her sister Eva that he was more attracted to. I mean, attracted to on a, I don't know about romantically, but attracted to perhaps as a person, because she was also writing poetry, and she became a poet herself, and she seems to have been very sympathetic to him about Maud Gonne. He spoke to her about Maud Gonne. He was in love with Maud Gonne. Constance probably wouldn't have been so sympathetic or confident on such matters as Eva would have been. And then isn't there a story about Yeats, and it's in my book, it is Yeats. Yeah, Yeats, they were having dinner in London one evening, and there's something about a tablecloth? He wrote...
Listen, this is brilliant, you'll have to buy the book.
Yeah, sorry, he wrote a poem on a tablecloth. Oh, I can't remember what it is, I'd have to... Sorry, I don't know the book by heart.
Can I just bring in the thing there, just on that? What was her relationship with Maud Gonne? Do you deal with that much in the book?
I do a bit, but I don't it was Maud Gonne really who kind of, introduced her to nationalism in the first place, in a way. I mean, they were more or less the same age. They had more or less the same upbringing. They were both Debs. When the Markieviczes moved back to Dublin, Maud Gonne came to visit, And it was she who, in fact, who introduced Constance to nationalist, to the Ilín na hÉireann, which was the women's branch, the women's branch of looking for general things, social justice, suffrage, the vote, and of course nationalist as well, very strongly nationalist. They were moving in the same circles, but then Maud Gonne went to live in Paris very quickly. She had to go to Paris because of her marital problems and so on. And so I don't think they really saw each other for many years. But then they fetched up in prison together in about 1918. They were in England, in Holloway, together, the two of them and Kathleen Clark, where they apparently spent a lot of time arguing. I think they were probably quite competitive. They were so similar, and I think that there was a bit of one-upmanship going on a lot between them, I would imagine.
But, and yet at the same time, Maud Gonne is the person who very seriously said that Markievicz wasn't taken seriously enough.
Exactly, yeah. Yeah, when Sean O'Faolain wrote the first biography of Markievicz, Maud Gonne was very annoyed about it and said that she had never been given the credit she deserved, and she was a great woman, and this was a bad book.
Okay, yeah?
I think one of the good aspects of the commemoration from last year is that for the first time it has begun to profile the valuable contribution women made to the whole 1912, 1916 up to 22 phase in our history. And that we find many of those women were from privileged backgrounds who had received education, which also then the Catholic women, they had travelled, and they really were making great inroads into beginning to shape society, whether it's Sadie Gregory, the cultural thing, or the Gifford sisters, or Maud Gonne and all the rest of them. But I think the regrettable thing is, after the Rising, it seems that the Catholic Church, the De Valera's, and all these, put them back in their box. They seem to have diminished their role very, very quickly. And it's one of those things that has maybe it hasn't happened so quickly.
I think about Margaret Ward's Unmanageable Revolutionaries, which is the book that. Do you want to say something on that, Anne?
Yeah, you see, I mean, it's not only last year that women have been, talked about. When I wrote the first version of that book, a great source for me was Unmanageable Revolutionaries, a book by Margaret Ward, who examined the whole role of women in that time. It's not true that that it hasn't been written about for a long time now. I think that.
But then it's forgotten. It's written about and then it's forgotten.
And then it's forgotten again.
The potential that was there in terms of women's issues, etc., that got shut down really fairly quickly. That's the sort of regrettable part back in 1916.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Irish Free State was a terrible time for everybody, not for women and men, indeed. There was a sense of retrenchment and putting stamping out on basically new ideas, new ways of there was a kind of a return to order. Let's get back to and I suppose it was a very traumatic time. Lots of people had been killed, families had suffered terribly. So I suppose people themselves were kind of cowed in a way, and felt this is the best way to go forward now.
And we do know that, for anybody who doesn't know, the unmanageable revolutionaries comes from a thing that De Valera said, in which he said that women are
The best
the best and the most unmanageable of revolutionaries. We know that. Any other questions?
A good biographer, I think, in the case of Markievicz, necessarily has to be a polemicist because of the character assassination that's involved. And you didn't name names, but Anne Matthews was the principal character assassin who was state-sponsored with a fictional play about a show trial which actually travelled to Paris with government funding. A well-researched biography that came out at the same time as yours by Lauren Arrington sat on the fence on that issue. But you didn't, not alone wrote about it in your biography, you confronted it in the press. And that's why I want to particularly compliment you for standing up publicly, not just in a book, but in the media, for Markievicz's character in relation to the Stephen's Green allegations.
Thank you.
Yeah. Very much.
Could I just ask about religion? I remember reading that at some stage in her life, quite well on in her life, she converted from Church of Ireland to Catholicism. I mean, was religion a big issue for her? Because it struck me as a strange thing for her to do.
I don't know. I think she was a very, when you think about, when you talk about Constance, you'll find yourself using very old-fashioned words like ardent and fervent and idealistic, and I think she was always those things. And so I'm not surprised that she kind of, she got religion, as you might say, later on in life, after, the life had proved, so disappointing in a way for her. She became Catholic in the 1920s at some point, and she, not only at some point, but like maybe about 1923 or something, and she wrote about how when she was in the College of Surgeons in that week, and of course everybody, people were, had very little food, people were going hungry, there was a kind of must have been a very strange and surreal time actually, and that people were saying the rosary, and that she felt something, or she saw something. She got a kind of a moment of, a Damascene moment, or a moment of recognition of some otherness. And when she converted to Catholicism a few years later, that was obviously, maybe something that had been evolving gradually.
Okay, well, thank you all very much. Thank you.